Welcome to our last video in our series on vertebrate diversity. In this video, we're going to focus on our last class in the vertebrate subphylum, the mammals. One of the interesting things we're going to do in this group is look at the three subclasses of mammals, the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placentals. But before we do that, before we look at this diversity, let's focus on the general characteristics of all mammals. What are the defining characteristics? There are a few characteristics that certainly are defining of mammals, and then one characteristic that is the defining. But let's start with the obvious one, hair. All mammals have hair. When we look at hair, it's a derivative of the skin. It's formed by the skin. It's made of keratin, which incidentally is the same protein that makes the scales of reptiles and the birds' feathers, which suggests that hair evolved from scales as did feathers. The next characteristic that we have that's defining of mammals is the presence of skin glands. Mammals have scent glands, sebaceous glands, which are oil glands associated with hair follicles, sweat glands, and finally, the defining characteristics of the group mammals, mammary glands, which produce milk. Mammals are the only animals that can sustain their young by feeding them from nourishment of their own body. That's pretty interesting. Let's take a closer look at these skin glands. If we zoom into this diagram, we can see that here's a hair follicle, and associated with that follicle is a sebaceous gland. It produces oil. That oil gland lubricates the hair as it moves out, and also so that hair is covered in oil, which gives our skin, and then the oil is also on our skin, which gives our skin a waterproofing, because only the oils are lipids, and lipids repel water. We also see in this diagram sweat gland, and the sweat is an excretion organ which gets rid of water to the surface, also ammonia and some salts, but as the sweat goes onto the surface of the skin, it evaporates away, which helps cool the body, so that's going to play a role in temperature regulation. It's also a derivative of the skin. I don't have a picture of scent glands, but let's look at mammary glands. Obviously, the mammary glands, again, are uniquely mammalian. That's where the name comes from. And there are these glands that are in the skin that produce milk, which can then be secreted out of the body to nourish the young. And both male and female mammals have mammary glands, but it's just the females where the hormone levels are at such a level that they actually produce, these glands are active and produce the milk. The next characteristic that we see in all mammals is a complex brain with convolutions. When we look at the mammal brain, it's pretty unique. Convolutions are folds, and you see all these folds that kind of looks like spaghetti in here. When you look at the brain of a fish or a reptile or an amphibian and even a bird, this part of the brain called the cerebrum is actually smooth. It doesn't have all these folds. And in the evolution of animals and the evolution of mammals, the size of the cerebrum, the top part of the brain that does the higher level processing, was growing, but the size of the brain case didn't grow as fast, and so in order to fit as much brain in the smaller space, the brain had to kind of fold in on itself, and so we see this very typical mammalian brain with these folds. That's like I said, indicative only found in mammals' brains. That when we look overall at the vertebrates, that it's the mammals that have the larger brains and the better sensory and nervous systems. The next characteristic that's uniquely mammalian is complex dentition, or teeth. When we talked about birds, we said the shape of the beak indicates the type of food the bird can eat, but when you look at the teeth of mammals, we also see some pretty interesting things. It's only in mammals that we have this differentiation of teeth, where we have the incisors up here for cutting, and the canines for grabbing and puncturing, and the premolars, and then the molars, which have the flat grinding surfaces. And different types of mammals will have a different distribution of these varied teeth. I mean, if you looked at sharks, all their teeth are basically the same, or maybe a crocodile. They're all just sharp, but this different functionality of different types of teeth, this differentiation is uniquely mammalian. But if you look at the teeth of a carnivore, you're going to see a lot more of the incisors and canines and less surface for the grinding teeth that you'd find. But an herbivore, an animal that was eating vegetable matter only, you would need these sharp canines and incisors, but you'd have a more emphasis on the large grinding flat molars and premolars. So if you look at the jaw of a of a mammal and investigate the teeth, you should be able to figure out the basic type of feeder that animal is. We as humans are omnivores, so we have the full range of teeth for eating both meat and vegetable matter. The next characteristic we can look at are the well-developed lungs with a diaphragm. The mammalian lung is well developed. They have good gas exchange. It's not as efficient as the birds with the extra air sacs, but it's pretty efficient. And we have a muscle down here underneath the lungs that's called the diaphragm, and it's the diaphragm that controls the breathing. And this is its shape, where it's kind of bowed like this. This is when it's relaxed. When this muscle contracts and gets smaller, it drops down. And as it drops down, it creates negative pressure, which sucks air down into the lungs. We call this negative pressure breathing, and we can contrast that with the positive pressure breathing we saw in the amphibians. But this is a well-developed lung. We have good gas exchange. Like I said, not as efficient as the birds, which had the extra air sacs, but efficient nonetheless. Now, these characteristics are uniquely mammalian. I didn't draw that the way I wanted to. But the next couple of characteristics that we're going to look at are shared by other animals, but they are still characteristics that all mammals share, but these are the ones that are uniquely mammal. Let's briefly talk about maternal care that we see in the mammals. Like I said, other animals will exhibit maternal care, but in the mammals that maternal care takes on a different nature. Obviously, with mammals having mammary glands and nursing their young, this connection between the mother and the offspring is much more intimate and important. The interesting thing, is the length of the maternal care. Kind of interesting. It seems to be that the larger the animal, the longer this maternal care lasts. So for maybe a rodent, the mother only takes care of the young for maybe a matter of like weeks, but for the elephants, for example, it may be many years, and of course in humans it takes on a whole different type of relationship where it can be many years. Next, let's look at the circulatory system. Now, with the birds, we already had our four-chambered heart. In fact, if we go back to the crocodilians and the reptiles, we had a four-chambered heart. And the mammals do also. And so I just put our diagram that we had from our earlier videos up here, and we can see the basic circulation in a schematic diagram. But if we want to look at what a mammalian heart looks like in a little more detail, this is a more accurate, more realistic representation of what the human heart or mammalian heart looks like. And so we see that the right atrium would receive deoxygenated blood from the body, from the top and bottom of the body, and pump that into the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle will pump that blood through the pulmonary arteries to the pulmonary loop to the two lungs. And then oxygen-rich blood would return from the lungs into the left atrium from both sides. This wraps around the back. And from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and then the right ventricle pumps the blood out to the systemic loop or out to the body. We'll talk more about the heart in our unit on the circulatory system when we do anatomy. And finally, all mammals are endothermic. They generate and regulate their own body temperature through their metabolism. Their high metabolic rate will generate heat, and then the hair that all mammals have plays a role in keeping them warm. Now, some of the marine mammals don't have as much hair, but they do have a thick layer of fat called blubber, and so hair or in fat help trap the heat, making them good endotherms. So that's the warming up, but we also have to cool down, and mammals have some pretty interesting physiological means to cool down, and I have done another video on temperature regulation in the anatomy and physiology unit. You can check that out if you want to see more of that. But mammals are endotherms, so they can live in a broad range of habitat. So there are general mammal characteristics. What we have left to do is to look at these three subgroups in the mammals and see what makes each of these subclasses, the monotremes, the marsupials, and the placentals, different from each other. We need to see what's the basis of this division, and it turns out it has to do with the reproductive event or the birth event.